Hey, hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Great to see so many of our familiar friends here this evening. Good evening and welcome to the Westdale Theater's Film Talk series, Love and the Screwball Comedy. My name's Jeff Bender, and in a moment we will be joined by Fred to talk about our third installment, Leo McCarey's charming 1937 classic, The Awful Truth. But before we begin, I would like to remind all of you at home that during our talk tonight, we would love to hear from you about your perspectives and questions about The Awful Truth, and by extension, any other of the Screwball comedies that have been on our roster or aren't on our roster for that matter. So on your screen, you will see a Q&A option below. And so just like Ralph Bellamy's fancy footwork, get your fingers tapping, and I will be sure to pass on as many of your thoughts as I can. And now it's my pleasure to pass the microphone to our host, producer, film and television, chairman of the board of the Westdale Theater, and of course, one of the most knowledgeable humans on the face of the earth about the golden age of Hollywood, Mr. Fred Fuchs. Good evening, Fred. Hello.
Hi, everybody. Welcome for that wonderful introduction, Jeff. I don't know how much of it's true, but appreciate it as always. Before we start, I did want to mention that next week, the Westdale is going to be partnering and sponsoring the Hamilton Jewish Film Festival. This is in partnership with the Hamilton Jewish Federation. This will be the third year we've done this. The first year was in the theater, last year was online. This year will be online as well. It starts on Sunday, and there are 8 films, and you can stream them online. I will be hosting 2 webinars where I'll be speaking with the directors and interviewing them. One is for a fantastic film, which is the documentary about the making about Fiddler on the Roof, both the play and the film. And then the second one is a fantastic young director from Italy, a Jewish director from Italy, and it's called Thou Shall Not Hate. And so same idea, you watch the film first, and then later we'll have an interview with these directors, and I welcome you to join us. And you can find out more information about it, of course, at thewestdale.ca. So, The Awful Truth. Well, that's sort of a wonderful title, isn't it? What could be the awful truth? And of course, the awful truth is it's really about love, And when I was thinking about the name of our series, Love and the Screwball Comedy, I was certainly thinking about this title, and it's certainly one of the better known titles. Many of you may have seen it before, but I think it's a wonderful commentary on love, and of course on marriage and on remarriage, which is a theme you'll see in a number of Screwball comedies from this period. So now this is 1937, and we're still very much in the Depression in America. It's starting to come out of it. The worst of it was in 33 and 34, but needless to say, audiences still love to go to the theater and see, wealthy people and beautiful sets and gorgeous wardrobe. And also films that sort of make fun of rich people and show them for all their foibles and their humanness. And this time, of course, you have a lot of fun with them as well, because they sort of have a sense of humor about themselves, which is quite charming. And needless to say, it was a very successful film, big box office hit. It was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actor. The director, Leo McCarey, won for Best Director. Enormously successful film at the time, and we'll talk a little bit about why. Again, to me, it started as a play. There was a play called The Awful Truth in 1923. And again, the basic story was the same: a distrustful rich couple. They begin divorce proceedings, then they begin to interfere in one another's romances. But in this case, the play was really just the premise for the movie, and that's about it. And in fact, this was Leo McCarey's first film he was directing for Columbia Pictures. And remember, Columbia Pictures was sort of the the great studio for screwball comedies, and when you think of, It Happened One Night, if you think of, 20th Century, many others, they were quite well known for this. But this was Leo McCarey's first film with them. And Leo McCarey, of course, was a very different kind of director than Howard Hawks or Frank Capra or some of the other, or certainly Ernst Lubitsch, in that Leo McCarey's style was very improvisational. And much of the dialogue and much of the comic elements in this film were actually improvised. And of course, we'll talk about that. And it really has to do, of course, with his own background. Cary Grant, this is often talked about as the film that really, when Cary Grant became Cary Grant, and his persona, and many of the sort of, little idiosyncrasies of his performances all started on this film. And then, of course, the top billing went to Irene Dunne, because Irene Dunne was actually a much more well-known star at this point. She had really been a great dramatic actress. She had done one comedy in 1936 called Theodora Goes Wild. And if you've never seen that movie, I highly recommend it. She was terrific in it. In fact, she was nominated for an Academy Award in that film. And then, of course, she did this right afterwards. And this really, really solidified her position in Hollywood as a great comedic actress as well. So when it came to Leo McCarey's background really goes back to the silent film days. He was involved with the Hal Roach studio, which was, the silent films, the two-reelers. He was sort of started as a gag writer. He actually was famous for putting Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy together. So, the early Laurel and Hardy movies were all directed by Leo McCarey. And a lot of what you see, and I'm going to give you some specifics, really came out of his understanding of sort of slapstick, and you see a lot of slapstick, of course, in this film. You see a lot of kind of that idea that great humor can come from this improvisational and sort of looser style, rather than being sort of a slave to a brilliant Ben Heck script, or to a director like Ernst Lubitsch, who's worked out everything himself. One of the great inspirations for Leo McCarey was a fantastic silent film actor named Charlie Chase, probably someone you don't remember, but hugely popular. And one of his unique qualities was, unlike the really goofy, silent film guys, he always used to kind of play it semi-straight. He would be a bit of a ladies' man. He would usually play kind of a hapless hero. He kind of provided a link between, leading man and kind of the goofball of, the Chaplin or Harold Lloyd or, Laurel and Hardy. And then, which brought us, of course, to Cary Grant, who quite remarkably, because very good looking, very dashing, ultimately had his greatest success in doing light comedy like this. The reason actually he was first hired by Harry Cohn was Cohn was having trouble with Frank Capra, because Frank Capra was becoming a little bit full of himself. And Columbia, again, was the poor sister studio to Paramount and MGM. They didn't make musicals or big period dramas. They were basically known for their sort of gangster films and for their comedies. So, Cohn decided he would sort of take a chance on this guy, Leo McCarey, and again, really gave him a chance to, though, of course, nobody felt comfortable with this director, who would often come to the set very uncertain about what he wanted to do that day. He was a musician, he was a songwriter. He'd sit and sort of play the piano for a while. Then he would, try to do a few scenes with the actors, coming up with new, dialogue and improvisation, physical humor, and it was really kind of, a wild thing. And at first, not easy for Cary Grant or for Irene Dunne. In fact, Cary Grant was so freaked out by this process, he actually tried to leave the movie. He went to Harry Cohn, offered to give his money back, or he wanted to trade roles, and he would take the Ralph Bellamy role, because he just had never worked with anybody in this kind of improvisational way. But of course, over time, he really started to get it. And not only did he get it, he became so great at it that often he contributed many original things to this film that we'll talk about. Again, this is about love, and one of the most amazing qualities to me of the film is, here are these two people on the verge of this divorce, but they rediscover each other and their love as they go along. And what really seems to bound them together is their sense of humor, and they're sort of in on it and nobody else is, right? So here we have, and this is sort of a motif of romantic comedy in general, but the couple who cross purposes at the beginning, and they have to go sort of this sort of trial by fire, and ultimately they do get a second chance and reborn, with a big greater sense of themselves and a strength from coming from sort of compromise and understanding. Now, Leo McCarey was quite a religious guy. He was a Roman Catholic, and some people see these transportations having almost religious undertones, that they have to prove themselves worthy, not only of each other, but of love itself. And in fact, McCarey was a very staunch Roman Catholic. And in fact, two of his most famous films that he went on to direct later on was Going My Way with Bing Crosby and The Bells of St. Mary, which were two huge hit films that very much spoke to sort of these kinds of religious themes in a very, very specific way, instead of sort of using comedy in this marriage as sort of a metaphor. So, again, the script from the beginning was kind of terrible. Nobody kind of cared. McCarey didn't really care that the script wasn't good. He was just going to kind of figure it out, and he knew how he'd figure it out. And he got very well paid. He got paid $100,000 to direct this movie. Just so you know, in today's money, that's like $3.5 million. So, and one of the tricks he did, of course, was because it was so improvised and nobody kind of knew what was happening and where it was going, he couldn't really be fired, because, who could take over this film? Often, studio films might have more than one director on them if, the studio boss got pissed off or didn't like the dailies. And at one point, Harry Cohn actually was quite upset because he couldn't figure out what was going on with all these improvised scenes and the whole style of production. But he couldn't fire, because there was no way the film would ever get finished. McCarey, again, he would talk about, because in the silent films, what we all remember, of course, were, the pie throwing, right? The pie throwing was always the great, action stunt, especially Oliver Hardy, all these films, right? And what was always fun about the pie throwing scenes was how innocent bystanders began to get caught. And it would be one pie and then another pie, and then it would just build and build until, it was sort of, Armageddon done. But here, it kind of is the same way. If you think of some of the verbal jousting that went on, the words, kind of the way they would sort of almost, project them at each other, and tumbling, overlapping, think of you could almost imagine there's being pies being thrown. And I think, again, McCarey was very sophisticated about this and really understood how to build the tension and build the scenes until, they would reach these, great moments. In fact, if you think about, the ending of the film, which really becomes a pile of chaos and just sort of pure motion, it reminds me of sort of what those silent films often were like, right? Now, again, some of the things we're used to in screwball comedies we don't see here. There aren't as many twists on, on gender, there's certainly, the code was, pretty much in practice at this point. So there had to be a little more discretion about some of the characterizations. Obviously, when Lucy starts impersonating Dixie Belle Lee, that's kind of a, extraordinary part of time and in the movie. And then sort of the, that protracted comic mortification, in the great dance floor scene with, with her suitor, Dan, played by Ralph Bellamy. These are all, they almost, again, it's like kind of like a, like steer wrestling, like a Laurel and Hardy move, slow builds, build through the different attitudes, and then, and then milking the gag, as long as he possibly could. And McCarey, would often talk about his films and sort of the visual that was like music, and the originality and the intensity came from, the constant changing of the characters' faces, and how they went from irony and self-mockery and love and despair and, almost like jazz, and the way jazz improvisational, starts to happen. A good example is really, the scene right at the beginning of the film. And, Jerry has had his 2 weeks Florida suntan, at the athletic club. And he comes home expecting a warm greeting. And instead, there's no Lucy, but there's Mr. Smith, the dog. And there's sort of this unease about what's going on. And you see, the stacks of unopened mail. And Grant, again, is such a physical actor. Remember, his background was vaudeville. He started as an acrobat, and he was not, that's real. He was always, a great physical character, but he had never been in a film that sort of challenged him in that way. He sort of was a handsome leading man, and played in dramas when he first started. But if you think about how he, sits on the sofa and he crosses his legs at this weird angle, and he takes such pleasure in sort of, sitting back and watching everything unfold, it really sets Cary Grant up. It sets the movie up for what it's going to be. And one of the extraordinary things about Cary Grant and his performance is that much of it is actually emulating the director himself. So Leo McCarey was very dashing, he had dark hair, and he was a fast talker and kind of a con man, and he had a lot of strange, gestures and mannerisms. And Cary Grant, was watching him and started to pick up on a lot of those things. And if you think about sort of his eye popping and thing, that, he's banging away at the piano, for example. These are all kinds of things that Leo McCarey himself would do, and ultimately really had a huge influence and became part of kind of Cary Grant's repertoire. Leo McCarey was a very fancy dresser, and Cary Grant sort of picked up on that, and always, after this film and in many of his films, always seems to dress very well. And so it's very interesting to see how the evolution of Cary Grant and this persona he created, Cary Grant, his real name was, Archibald McLeish, came about and really solidified itself for the first time in this film. And even equally remarkably is what happened with Irene Dunne. So she had started sort of, feminist heroine, in Cimarron and Ann Vickers. And it's not that she was prim, but she was a serious kind of, actress. And it wasn't until, Theodore Goes Wild just before, and then The Awful Truth, became this kind of, really not zany and crazy. She certainly was no Carole Lombard. I think part of her charm was that she was not, a ditzy kind of actress. She was always a lady. She was always smart and kind of witty and kind of in on the joke and could laugh at herself. It's a more sophisticated character in some ways than you've seen in the earlier Screwball comedies that we've shown. She was a singer at first. She was trying to become an opera singer, and she didn't really think comedy was for her. And then it was only after her singing career kind of didn't go so far, though she did insist on singing in every one of her films. And of course, one of the most famous scenes is this, the unbelievable duet of Home on the Range, right? That she and Ralph Bellamy have together. And again, this was completely improvised. They were just sort of horsing around at the piano and, trying to harmonize. And Irene Dunne was, just mortified by her, her own kind of off-pitch silliness, and at one point just stopped and McCarey had been rolling the cameras. They didn't even know they were being shot. And he yelled cut, and ultimately this becomes, a very, very, a very wonderful, but primarily, improvised scene that I think says a lot about both of their characters. Again, she was really thought of as sort of the first lady of Hollywood. And also she was an actress that women especially loved. Sometimes, the men, went for the Carole Lombards and women, weren't so sure about that, but everyone loved her because she was a lady. And in fact, even I can remember my father's mother, who was a poor immigrant, always thought, oh, Irene Dunne, she was a lady, and that was like the highest compliment you could ever give someone, is that they were a lady, So what else can I tell you about McCarey? Now he did a lot of other great movies. Of course, he was the director of Duck Soup, with the great Marx Brothers film, possibly their greatest film. He made a film right before this called Make Way for Tomorrow, which in his mind was actually a better film than The Awful Truth. It's worth seeing for sure, but maybe not quite as modern as this one feels. Again, part of his technique was he didn't want the cast to come in, where they were all set with their memorized lines and had psychoanalyzed their characters and, kind of had worked out exactly what they were going to do before they even showed up on the set. So he always wanted to keep control by kind of throwing these, throwing the script out, throwing an improvised scene in, mixing this up. It's a very clever technique that other great directors picked up on. It's something that Francis Coppola, very much did in his direction. And I can remember him mentioning Leo McCarey to me. And the joke with Francis was the script was a newspaper, because every day he'd publish a new one. And often he would just move lines around just to kind of keep the actors on their toes. So they never got too settled into their performance. Because at the end of the day, what I think makes this film so successful and many films is when they feel alive, when they feel like, there's something fresh and something's like happening, magically in front of your eyes. It's not some, staged, well thought out time, like an Ernst Lubitsch movie, is the exact opposite of this, or Alfred Hitchcock's movies are the exact opposite of this. So quite interesting how he managed to achieve this. Again, most of it was due to his training, doing many of these silent films, and again, even the two-reelers. He did win his first Academy Award for this movie, which I think was very well deserved. Peter Bogdanovich's comment is, after The Awful Truth, when it came to light comedy, there was Cary Grant, and then everyone else was an also ran. Cary, and again, when you think of the run of films that Cary Grant did after this, with His Girl Friday and the Philadelphia Story and the Arsenic and Old Lace, and this really, it was sort of a magical period in Grant's life for those 4 or 5 years after this movie, where he just made some of the greatest comedies of all time. And very influential director. Again, the improvisation, and how many directors would get inspired by this, and which created that kind of spontaneity. He wasn't the only one who would work this way. George Stevens, the great George Stevens, was also, worked at the Hal Roach studio and did a lot of improvisation. Greg LaCava was another director who really, focused on improvisation. But again, what really made this work is there's kind of, at least for me, there seems to be a very authentic kind of reality to these characters that is, as zany or crazy the situation might be, they still feel rooted in kind of, real honest feelings and emotion. And in fact, the great French director, Jean Renoir, paid a great tribute to saying Leo McCarey understood people better than any other Hollywood director, which is, quite an extraordinary statement coming from Jean Renoir, right? Irene Dunne, again, she wanted to be an opera singer. She performed in Broadway. She wound up getting nominated for Academy Awards 5 times, never actually won one. But she was a top, one of the top paid actress at the time, working at Columbia. She never had a contract with Columbia. She was very independent. She never wanted to get involved in kind of that kind of situation. So she stayed quite independent. But Awful Truth was something they really had Irene Dunne in mind from the very beginning. McCarey at first really didn't want her. He thought that, he was worried. She's such a genteel actress. But then he started to recognize that the incongruity of seeing someone who the audience thinks of as a genteel actress doing screwball comedy would be really funny. And obviously she saw, and her agent, Charles Feldman, saw the potential, and she got top billing and was paid enormous. She got paid $75,000, which, again, was, over $1 million in those times. Dunne, like Lombard, was very popular with her co-workers. She was not, a movie star. She was very approachable and warm. She was sort of had that gracious manner. She really sort of became, royalty, part of the royalty of Hollywood. And there were, as one of the great reviewers said, there's something about Irene Dunne that makes every man in the room unconsciously straighten his tie when she walks in. And again, her nickname was the First Lady of Hollywood. And she really was a real lady, unlike, the Carole Lombards and some of these other characters. She was always very elegantly dressed. She was always on the best dressed list, a very stylish celebrity. So, many of the things that made her a real star, even though I think today people maybe don't know Irene Dunne as well as they know, Katharine Hepburn and some of these other actresses, even though she did many very brilliant things. Again, they made this film under the production code, but they did get away with some stuff, with Cary Grant and the implication they're sharing a bed, and one of the reasons I think they did get away with it was because it was considered such a classy movie, that it was, with top actors and a big budget, and so they got away with a little bit of sort of implications and nuances that maybe other films couldn't. Irene Dunne later said, Cary Grant always said that I had the best timing of anybody he ever worked with. Lucille Ball actually often would talk about Irene Dunne and her comedic skills and how much her performances influenced Lucille Ball. There's that incredible scene where, Irene Dunne plays Cary Grant's, ill-bred nightclub performance sister. And that scene was literally written over the weekend, and she was just handed it, on a Monday morning, say, okay, let's go do it. And she was supposed to do, sort of a burlesque bump in the middle of that musical number, and a move she wasn't necessarily completely comfortable with, and so McCarey says, why don't you just say never could do that when that moment came? And she did say it, and it stayed in the film. And it was kind of a wonderful little comic moment, just again to give you some idea of how this improvisation worked. Another improvised moment was actually the very end of the movie. This crazy idea, right, of the cuckoo clock, and how the male figure and the female figure, and how the male figure kind of follows the female character back through the door. What a perfect and sort of censor-friendly substitute for showing Cary Grant climbing into bed with Irene Dunne, and that was a tribute to a member of the crew who they were literally just shooting away, and someone in the crew came up with that idea. Cary Grant, I think we've talked about, in his classic timing. Again, started with Blonde Venus and Marlene Dietrich, and a bunch of more. But then he started with this role with Awful Truth, and Bringing Up Baby, 38, and His Girl Friday, 1940, Philadelphia Story, 1940. Penny Serenade, 1941, another great movie with Irene Dunne. They actually worked together 3 times. But I'm not sure, I don't believe Cary Grant ever actually won an Academy Award. He was nominated twice, once for None But the Lonely Heart, and I think he was also nominated for Penny Serenade. But again, as like today, the Academy didn't really recognize comedies as sort of being Oscar worthy, and it was very rare that a comedy would get Oscar nominations, and or certainly would win. In fact, when Grant, as I mentioned, was part of the vaudeville circuit, he became very fond of and spent time with the Marx Brothers. And if you think of Zeppo Marx, sort of the straight man Marx, Cary Grant often credited Zeppo Marx for being an early role model for him of what he could do. So, again, he did a bunch of good movies, and then this one is the one that really was another great movie he did actually just right before this, called Topper. If you remember that, Screwball comedy, this was MGM, where he plays with Constance Bennett these ghosts who sort of wreak havoc on this poor family, and really sort of set him up for The Awful Truth, which followed pretty much right after that. Again, what I think audiences love is that he's not depending on his good looks. He wasn't a narcissist. He sort of acts as though he's sort of an ordinary young man, and that somehow makes it even more appealing that this handsome young man is actually really funny, and it's sort of unexpected that how could he be so good looking and also be funny and intelligent, but it absolutely works. And when you think about some of the movements that he began to stylize, first the eye popping, you see that in his performance, the cocked head, he sort of has that forward lunge. You often see his sort of a slightly ungainly stride. These are all characteristics that you would see perhaps developed by a master cartoonist for a cartoon character. But Grant really was able to take those kinds of little techniques and use them in his performances, and many of them first developed in this movie. Grant was cast 3 days after Dunne, so they were both pretty much set for the movie, even though there wasn't much of a script. But they were both eager at first to work with Leo McCarey because, of course, his great history in comedy and doing such great work in comedy. Later on, Grant, of course, went on to do many other great movies, the Hitchcock movies, North by Northwest, Charade. He really became that great leading man. Something people may or may not know about Cary Grant is that he became very interested in the late 50s in the drug LSD, and is actually, quite known for his experimentation with LSD in the late 50s. And it's estimated he was involved in 100 different sessions. And he was actually, quite a bit of a proponent of the use of LSD in terms of working with, psychological patients and things like that. And sort of an apostle of LSD. I don't know if you know that story or not, but I always found that kind of interesting. Ralph Bellamy, is Dan Leeson. Well, again, this was a character he creates in this movie. You see many times, most famously, of course, in His Girl Friday. Again, ran away, poor family when he's 15, tried to make his way through theater, started off more as a capable supporting actor. He was part of this very famous kind of Irish mafia in Hollywood, a sort of a boys club. I've heard anyone speak about this before, but it was James Cagney and Pat O'Brien and Spencer Tracy, Frank Morgan. Ralph Bellamy was very much part of that kind of Irish, group, and they all helped each other a lot in terms of getting ahead in Hollywood and supporting each other, and obviously doing a lot of drinking. When the first script for this, the character of Dan Leeson was nothing like Ralph Bellamy. It was sort of this sort of dry, kind of formal character that maybe Roland Young would have played, but McCarey had this idea of changing it to be someone from the American West. There was a writer brought in, Mary McCall, and she and Ralph Bellamy basically kind of rewrote all his scenes in like an afternoon, and Dorothy Parker came in to kind of do a little ghostwriting on it. And anyhow, I just think he's wonderful in this film. And as always, incredible cast of supporting actors: Robert Horwick, Cecil Cunningham as Aunt Patsy. I think you've seen her in other Screwball comedies. And then, of course, Skippy, the famous dog, Mr. Smith. And Skippy you probably recognize, because of course Skippy is Asta in the Thin Man film series. And Skippy was also the dog in Bringing Up Baby. And Skippy was actually, although he's a very famous movie dog, was not so easy to work with. And there's that very critical scene where where Cary Grant's trying to get him to pick him, and he has that the rubber mouse, the famous dog's the dog's favorite toy, and in his breast pocket, and he tries to hold his arms open so Skippy will jump. They just couldn't get this scene right. In fact, they actually had to. It took several days, and even, the human cast had to wait for a day or two because Skippy was booked on another film before he could come back and they could finish that movie. When they started, as I said, it was quite a disaster. There was no rehearsal. Irene Dunn would, break into tears. She was so frustrated. Grant was so nervous that he couldn't prepare his part. He tried to back out of the movie. It was nothing like they had ever experienced before. And in fact, Grant wrote a 8-page memorandum. What's wrong with this picture? And, if you please let me out of it, I'll do another one for free, but nobody, everybody decided eventually, let's just work together. And although McCarey, for years still kind of harbored a grudge against Grant for trying to get out of the picture, we can all see the result of it was amazing. And soon the three leads began to realize that McCarey was a comedy genius, and they really could, trust him and allow this kind of the sequences to evolve. And Ralph Bellamy could wear his own personal wardrobe. There was sort of a flexibility to all of this that it was, again, very unusual for that time, right? And then, of course, they wound up having so much fun, and there was so much laughter, and they were having such a great time making the movie. And I think you actually can feel that in some of the scenes, that there is this kind of joy that these characters have in doing this, and they don't break character, but you really see something, I think, kind of extraordinary going on, and one of the reasons it's so good. And of course, Grant was so good at these pratfalls, and McCarey would let him kind of come up with routines like with the chair and everything else. And So and in some ways it was a personal film for McCarey, because he called it the story of his life, because he, with his own life, had many of these kind of comic moments and scenes, and and the boys' night out from the wives, were sort of typical scenarios, and the alibis. Some of the stuff was stolen from old silent movies. The bowler hat sequence in Lucy's apartment, that was a standard bit that was used in Laurel and Hardy movies. And in fact, that bit is also in Duck Soup, which he directed. And, and the kind of mishaps with the car radio, again, not unsimilar to a sequence in Duck Soup. And again, McCarey just let it play, and never, it didn't matter that, some of these unrelated sketches would appear, that it was all going to work at the end. And I think it did. Let's see, another improvised scene. The Cary Grant, McCarey came up himself with the idea of arguing over a dog rather than the property. Remember, when they come in, first they were in the script, they were going to have a fight about, the property. And then, of course, instead they were arguing about who gets to keep the dog, which was so much more funny. And that was sort of improvised at the last minute, There was a little concern at first when they tested the film that it may not be quite as, I see. Yeah, this was again, improvised scene that, Jerry was going to be tickling Lucy with a pencil, right? When he's hiding behind the door, when, Dan comes to Lucy's door. And again, it was hard sometimes for them to keep a straight face, because it was all happening so fast, and it was all, kind of, it was so funny. There was the great song, of course, Gone with the Wind. No, what was it called? It Happened with the Wind. My dreams are gone with the wind, and the wind machine, blowing her off. And, that was very funny. Kind of a little bit of a parody on, Gone with the Wind, which was a very famous book. It hadn't been made into a movie yet. But Irene Dunne choreographed all her own dancing. Especially that bit with the long handkerchief, right? That was sort of a classic comedy routine you would have sort of seen in a silent film. God, I could go on and on. A critical plot point about the 90 days. The film was supposed to be set in Connecticut. Turns out there's no law about that in Connecticut. So kind of at the last minute, they had to change it into New Jersey. Sometimes the improvisations actually would create continuity problems. And in fact, there's in the court scene, you see Jerry sometimes standing, sometimes he's sitting, during the divorce proceedings. The two songs were written ahead of time by Ben Oakland and Milton Drake. I Don't Like Music, My Dreams Are Gone with the Wind. They were finished ahead of time. And again, Irene Dunne was a singer and really enjoyed singing. And again, that crazy choreography of the Balboa stomp at the nightclub scene, which was not a real dance. That was something they made up, and then Irene Dunne's try to imitate him, and it was very intense, and they did it quite a long time. And of course, for Ralph Bellamy, it was a lot of work. And but again, one of the funniest sequences in the movie, of course. And photography, I thought, was beautifully done. Joseph Walker, one of the top photographers of the time, mainly, very long takes, right? Sort of helps the idea. It's very spontaneous and energetic. Most of the scenes would just be sort of shot once, multiple takes, lots of coverage. Shooting days were short, which, was often a lot of fun, for the actors. There was a lot of trouble with the final scene because they couldn't find a cat that would sit still to block the door, and eventually they got one that worked. It was one of the biggest problems had, was finding that cat. Most of it was shot, of course, on the sound stage at Gower Street, a little bit out in Burbank on their back lot. Not a lot to do with the editing because, it was sort of edited in camera, but there was some really wonderful editing, I think, in this movie, especially, during the nightclub scene, and we're seeing Dixie Belle Lee's performance, and cuts to Jerry and Lucy and Dan, and Dan, his sort of deadpan, it's really quite brilliant, I think. And anyhow, very, very beautifully done, a lot of great craft. Only shot in 6 weeks, very quickly. Tested. It tested good. It didn't test great because it sort of got a little slow started. So they actually did a reshoot, which is the scene when Lucy calls her attorney to discuss the impending divorce. And the bit in this scene that was added was that the lawyer, remember, his wife is standing in the background yelling at him, the dinner is ready. And while the lawyers try to say marriage is a beautiful thing. And, 3 times, and finally, the 3rd time, attorney, shouts back, shut your big mouth. And everybody starts laughing. It immediately told everyone what this movie was going to be and how funny it was going to be. And again, even improvised, but so many great lines, especially Ralph Bellamy. Watching it this time, you realize how brilliant Ralph Bellamy actually was. And that wonderful sequence where he says to Lucy, are you sure you don't like that fella? And Lucy says, like him? You saw the way I treated him, didn't you? And Bellamy says, that's what I mean. Back on my ranch, I got a little red rooster and a little brown hen, and they fight all the time too. But every once in a while, they make up again, and they're right friendly. So, not to say there wasn't great dialogue in this as well. So, I hope you all enjoyed it as well. And what do you think, Jeffrey? Should we go to some of the slides and go through them real quick? And what have we got here to look at? Okay, so the opening scene when he's supposedly in Florida and he's got his club, and again, they're both, they're kind of deceitful people, but you don't really ever think of them as being bad people. This is all just sort of the fun of it, right? Next one. Look at these beautiful gowns, of course. That was a huge part of the film, and the expectation of the audience to see these beautiful gowns and beautiful, jewelry. And here she's arriving with her voice teacher, Next one. Wonderful moment. They're joking about the continental mind, I think that was probably in the script. Next one. This is the scene we were talking about, with the divorce court, and they're each trying to get Skippy to choose them. Next one. Here we have Aunt Patsy. What a great character. Introducing, Ralph Bellamy, who's into oil and from Oklahoma. That was all not in the original script. That was all made up later. Next one. So he was charming but dull. It became like the Ralph Bellamy type. It was what everybody wanted. He did such a great job in creating this kind of character that it really became very iconic. Next one. This is, of course, when the two of them meet, and you can look at Cary Grant and both of them, and they just, all 3 of them, they just had such great comic expressions and timing. And next one is when they do their duet. I'm sure this was all pretty much improvised. This is very much Leo McCarey, kind of sitting at the piano and banging away and having lots of fun. Next one. My dreams are gone with the wind. And of course, this is just really basically a setup for, when Irene Dunne, kind of reprises this unbelievable sequence. And if you go to the next slide, you can see, look at these expressions, watching her. I was referring to in terms of the editorial of this sequence and why it worked so well. Next slide. This is, do I dance? I could dance till the cows come home, right? And meanwhile, Cary Grant's asking the band leader, play it again. Next one. You can just see how much he's enjoying this moment. And, it really established him as, the great star he is. Next slide. Oh yeah, this is the famous, singing of Oklahoma, of Home on the Range, I mean. Neither of them just sort of goofing around and not realizing it was being shot. And suddenly, and the crew was laughing so hard, they almost couldn't use the tape, but it worked. Next scene. Yeah, so this is sort of, a little bit of the, confronting about their indiscretions, and we can see Dan's quite infatuated. Man's best friend is his mother. Next one. Yeah, crossing his fingers. That's an old kind of, silent film gag. She's as pure as the driven snow, as faithful as she is fair. He crosses his fingers. Next one. Yeah, so this kind of gets very slapsticky, of course, with the tickling with the pencil. But this was slapstick and improvisation at its best. Next one. Yeah, sort of more of the same. Look at the eye rolls. This was all stuff from silent film that he picked up from Leo McCarey. Next one. Yeah, again, great slapstick with the jujitsu from the manservants, and he did all his own stunts, all his own tumbling and acrobatics. Cary Grant was very talented in that way. Next slide. Yeah, so again, she was a professional singer. She knew how to do this. Again, this is an important scene because they find out they weren't really having an affair. It really was a recital. Next one. Yeah, more slapstick with the chair, wrestling with the chair. And of course, Lucy's watching all of this. Next slide. And recognizing, I guess, that this is really the man for her. They are sort of perfect partners in many ways. Next slide. Yeah, again, another beautiful costume. Look at that. Very, I guess, deco-ish in 1937. Wonderful gowns. Next one. Yeah, this is the famous bowler hat sequence. Again, you've seen this from Laurel and Hardy. Next one. Yeah, with the Skippy hiding, and then of course hiding the hat, and then the next one, of course, is the business about the hat not fitting, and tuck your ears in, and then of course we don't actually get to see the actual brawl. That kind of happens off camera. Maybe they felt that was a little too much. Next slide, please. Yep. So, they're drinking a toast to their divorce, but there's something about them. You can just tell, even the way, they're both drinking with the same hand, and that they're so well matched for each other. They're really meant to be together. Next one. Yes. So here she is, Jerry's bratty sister, Lola. Very funny bit, and of course, making a lot of fun of Barbara, sort of this straight woman. Next scene. Yep, this is the one I was talking about, where she tries to do her burlesque bump. All choreographed by Irene Dunn. Next one. Yeah, on the motorcycles, very charming. And then, she hops up and down to set off the alarm. A little bit of a sexual innuendo there. And then next scene, here she is, really, is beautiful and sexy. And you're all confused, aren't you? I would be confused too. Next scene. And, again, this is very clever how, with the door and the nightshirt, and, you want to get them back into bed together, but that can't quite work. And, and anyhow, they're different, but they're different they're both different in sort of the same way. And then, of course, better than even getting into bed together is the shot, next slide, of the cuckoo clock, right? And then him following her into the, through the door. And then in the last two more shots, so this is Leo McCarey with Cary Grant. And I think you can certainly see what a dashing, good-looking guy he was, and how Cary Grant certainly was able to pick up a lot of his qualities, and I keep calling Cary Grant because Cary Grant was a character of fiction. That wasn't really who Archibald MacLeish was, but he really created that character so well in this movie, and then repeated it many times. And then the last one, yeah. So this is, again, the director, who was actually a very good songwriter. He was nominated for an Academy Award for one of his songs, but this was his thing, was to sit at the piano and just kind of play show tunes and sing until he got inspired and come up with some great ideas for the movie. So there we go. Thank you so much, as always, Jeffrey. Great slides. And any questions from you or other people in the audience? Very curious to hear what everyone thought of the movie.
Well, Fred, on a couple of occasions, you've, of course, referred to McCarey's background in working with Hal Roach and many of the slapstick pieces that he probably created himself. What is the difference in your mind, or how would you define the difference between slapstick and screwball comedies?
Well, that's a great question. Obviously, slapstick was first, in silent films. They really weren't sort of screwball comedies in silent films. Slapstick was so, the audiences were used to it, of course, because vaudeville, was based on slapstick, and most of the comedians were, did a lot of slapstick. And, if you think of Buster Keaton and when his vaudeville acts, etc. Screwball comedies were more sophisticated usually, and of course they had dialogue. That's what they were known for, with very witty and very fast-paced dialogue. And as you've seen, some of the early screwball comedies didn't have that much slapstick. If you think of, It Happened One Night, or, Trouble in Paradise, they were really trying to be more sophisticated and kind of a little more character driven. And so, slapstick is sort of it's a technique, it's a craft that you do see in films. Obviously, you see a lot of it in this film, and you'll see it in some of the other screwball comedy, particularly the one you're talking about next week in The Lady Eve. There's a lot of slapstick. And so I think that the inventive directors realized that it's a great tool in their toolbox, and a great way to get a laugh, big laughs kind of quickly without necessarily a lot of work per se. But it was always, but slapstick is not easy to do. The timing is critical, the editing is critical, the pace of it, how it develops and grows. And I think, again, this film was unique, and it really showed how there was a place for slapstick in the screwball comedy, and how they worked so well together, and inspired other directors to continue to do the same.
Cool. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, we've been thinking about Skippy or Mr. Smith throughout the picture, and did you have much experience working with animals in your
Oh, that's a great question. I'm trying to remember if I had any unique animal experiences that it's a very quick story. I'll try to tell the quick version of it, but I had an experience with rats, because we were doing a TV series called Fairy Tale Theater, and we were doing the Pied Piper of Hamlet. And we were in LA, but for some reason we had to shoot this in Toronto because David Bowie, and he couldn't come to the States for tax reasons. So we were convinced, this guy convinced us to bring 300 trained rats to Toronto, to Glen Warren Studios, and that he would be able to get them to, follow the guy around and do all the, the rat stuff that you have to have in the Pied Piper. And we did it. And surprisingly, he actually could get these rats to do something. But the fun part of the story is when we left, he didn't bring any rats home with him. I'm convinced that studio must have had rat problems for years after that. There were no more rats, but maybe there are other stories. That's the only one that comes to mind.
Thanks, Fred. From Lindy Obb and more of a comment. This week's movie was so much fun. Wasn't quite sold on this previous film, but really loved this one quite a bit, and quite looking forward to more.
Good. Well, I think, look, if you guys haven't seen these movies, I'm just thrilled you're getting a chance to be exposed to them, because these are great classic films that shouldn't be forgotten. And in fact, really inspired comedy in the future. And in fact, as you know, the last film we're doing is What's Up, Doc, which was done in the early 1970s and is a screwball comedy, with Barbra Streisand and Ryan O'Neal, where a lot of these things are reprised in modern day. But you see impact of this in comedy all the time.
Lindy's got another good question, and it's so we know she was not cheating, but was Cary Grant what was he doing for 2 weeks when he was supposed to be in Florida? Wasn't really addressed. It's kind of, it's a bit vague. Lily seemed to address this at the end of the movie with all the double talk about how he had changed and was not the same, and he would have to be not the same for their reconnection to work. What are your thoughts on that? What was he up to?
I think they were intentionally vague. There's some moral issue here that certainly is worth exploring. Remember, in 1937, I think there was obviously a very different attitude in terms of how men behaved and women behaved, and I think the idea that a man might have an affair or a wild night out but still be a wonderful husband, I don't know, was that maybe more acceptable then? But the point really is that it's not really the point, whether he did or he didn't. The point was that this couple had become estranged, and they really had, and really thought that they were no longer suited to be together. Their jealousy, their attitudes towards each other, and it's a wonderful kind of, again, story of redemption, how they found each other and recognized and kind of went through this experience of them being involved perhaps or not involved with other women, and so I think you're right. It's a good question, and I think, again, it was intentionally vague because nobody really wanted to be making a big moral statement in the film.
Thanks, Fred. Jeffrey Eden mentions that that was not even nominated for costumes. Was that an Oscar category back then?
Yes, of course it was. But again, it was a comedy, right? So, they don't think of comedies in terms of set design or wardrobe. And, often the best picked, the best production design or best wardrobe costumes would go to period films, where they were recreating some lush period or, doing something, that was, hundreds of extras and kind of brilliant over the top. This was more stylish dressing, and certainly, but not what the Academy, who really was trying to bring kind of a legitimacy and a sense of a professionalism to this kind of the flim flam movie business, because that's what it was for a long time, when theaters where important things happen, films were just sort of commercial entertainment, right? From Nickelodeon days. So they weren't as likely to recognize a comedy for that. I'm sure there are times when they did, but I'm just saying in general, that might have been why you didn't see any nominations for any of that.
Thanks, Fred. Caroline Hill-Smith has a comment. I love this film. I wasn't aware of how really well acted and choreographed early movies could be. And the choreography you mentioned throughout the film was a bit surprising to me. I did not know Dunn had done that on her own.
Yeah. She was a very smart, very, very clever woman. And again, I wouldn't say alone, it was with the director, but it was interesting. Again, it was very improvised. And in fact, in the famous dance scene with her and Cary Grant, Leo McCarey wouldn't hire a professional choreographer. He actually hired like some kid, to be the choreographer, because he didn't want it to be polished choreography. He wanted it to be kind of goofy and, funny steps and things like that. So it was very intentional and in that way, kind of, again, I can't emphasize this much. What I loved so much about this film was its sense of life, its sense of being alive and not overly planned and rehearsed and plotted and carefully edited and carefully lit, and it just kind of flows, and it's fast paced, but it's not trying to be his Girl Friday. It just kind of has its own tone, and that's what great directors do, is they create tone, right? And there's a consistency of the tone, there's a consistency in the performances that really makes this kind of feel very special and a little bit of sort of a jewel of a film.
I would agree. That recital scene where she lets out that giggle, it just seems so real to me. I mean, really emphasizes the relationship between the two of them. It's quite lovely.
Great example.
Jeff Duncanson writes, love how sly and clever the writing is. I'm thinking in particular of how Dunn comes in and completely destroys the football story, the Preston story that Grant's telling his snobby in-laws to be. Her timing there is perfect.
Yeah. Again, I don't know how much of that was scripted or if some of that was improvised. Obviously, the basic setup of the scene certainly was scripted, but I don't know if it came out of a rehearsal moment or not. But certainly, there's very good dialogue and smart dialogue. Again, not known as some, like Billy Wilder or it's Ben Hecht, scripts. It wasn't that kind of super tight, and jokes and payoffs, but wonderful writing, and who knows, I mean, Dorothy Parker worked on it. I don't know who else worked on it. In fact, Sidney Buchanan worked on it, great screenwriter. So it was a very different time, remember, in Hollywood, when people are under contract, and multiple people often worked on, especially writers. At a studio, you would have a story department and you'd have a screenplay department. And they were completely different, people who worked in each department. And, the story department developed the stories. And then when they were done, they would turn them over to the screenplay department. And the screenplay department would craft them and turn them into, scripts. And, it was, it was a factory. It was a studio system. And it was very successful, obviously, and hugely talented. F. Scott Fitzgerald and, William Faulkner, hugely talented people working in the studio system. And then the director would come along and he'd sort of shoot the movie. And then the producer, or the studio boss was really responsible for all the editorial. But you had occasional strange, guys who didn't really fit the system, like Leo McCarey. And they would do things that, as I said, nobody could kind of screw around with this movie, because he didn't shoot any extra takes. He didn't shoot any extra coverage. It was kind of, this is it. You kind of cut it together, and and this was the movie. So it was a way that John Ford used to do that as well. John Ford would edit in the camera, and he would only shoot the footage he absolutely wanted to be in the movie, so nobody could screw around with it later on when he was off directing his next movie. So that's how these smart directors used to kind of protect themselves.
A couple more. Judy Marcellus is saying, a quick question. You mentioned the Oscars earlier. Would be interested in your thoughts about the Oscars last night. A little off topic, but
that's okay. Look, it was, I don't know what to say. There's so much tragedy and sadness going on everywhere. And, they did the best they could, but this was not the Academy Awards. I've been to the Academy Awards a number of times, and you just can't even imagine the feeling of celebration and the energy in the room. The best show at the Academy Awards didn't even happen on stage. It was happening in the audience, right? And so none of that was going on, and trying to isolate everybody. And then, of course, doing the musical numbers early on, it was great in terms of being able to present the musical numbers in their best way. But then the show itself had no shift in energy, right? So usually, okay, now we're going to do a great production number. Now we're back to giving awards. So it was just sort of this kind of same old turning out these awards. And so I was happy to see all the diversity and to see the recognition for some great artists who made movies last year. But I really, I really felt bad. It was wonderful to see the Academy Museum, which has been in the works for like over 10 years. And to see that that's actually going to be opening in September, that's a fantastic accomplishment and, big landmark from Los Angeles. And I think that was good. But in general, I thought, they did the best they could, but it was very, and of course, ratings were down like 60% from last year. I mean, nobody watched it and nobody really watched the movies. And I think they tried a little bit to kind of get people excited about going back to the theater and big movies that are coming up, but it really wasn't appropriate in a way. I mean, that's not what the show was supposed to be there for. So anyhow, let's just hope next year will be very, very different.
Great question, Judy. Thanks for that. Well, let's go out on Margarita's comment, and the Oscar goes to Skippy. She loved the movie. My stomach still hurts from so much laughing. Heartwarming, great for these dark days. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Well, I'm really glad you enjoyed it. And unfortunately, I will not be with you next week because I'll be hosting this Jewish film festival, but you'll be in Jeffrey's very capable hands. And I'm very sorry I won't be there because he's actually going to be talking about one of my absolute favorite directors and one of my very favorite films. So why don't you give us a little preview of that, Jeff?
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited to be talking about director and screenwriter Preston Sturges's 1941 screwball romp, The Lady Eve, starring two actors who up to this point in their careers were not noted for comedy, and that would be Henry Fonda and a favorite of these Film Talk series, Barbara Stanwyck. The movie's a screwball masterpiece, and it's one of the director's best movies, as our story focuses on Fonda's heir to a brewery empire, who is more interested in snakes and science than suds and love. So enter Stanwyck. She's a wily card sharp who, while trying to con Fonda, falls for him. Roger Ebert said of The Lady Eve, if I were to ask to name the single scene in all of romantic comedy that was sexiest and funniest at the same time, I would advise beginning at 6 seconds past the 20-minute mark in Preston Sturges' The Lady Eve, and watching as Barbara Stanwyck toys with Henry Fonda's hair in an unbroken shot that lasts 3 minutes and 51 seconds. I love that he had his stopwatch out. But please watch more than just that as we get together again next Monday night at 7 p.m. And incidentally, we're going to talk about Preston Sturges' stock repertory of incredible character actors and explore his career as Hollywood's premier writer-director, who between, and catch this, 1940 and 44, in 4 years made 8 of some of the best screwball comedies of movie history for Paramount Pictures. So I'm excited to be able to spend time with all of you next week, same time.
Good. Well, enjoy, and then again, we'll be back here 2 weeks from now to wrap up this series, and I hope you've been all enjoying it. And thanks so much for joining us tonight, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Good evening.
Good
Thanks,
evening. Bye-bye.